Hey, Rommel, thanks for joining me here to talk about experimentation team structure. I want to start off right off the bat getting into the heart of it, your experience with, what is your experience with experimentation team structures, pods, squads? Who's that team that you work with? Are you working from a standpoint of a center of excellence or from a sort of a project-based operating model where you're kicking over requests over to a dedicated support team that's not part of your team? Just talk to me generally about experimentation team structure from your point of view. On maybe you've got some stories on what's worked well and what doesn't. But what's your latest stance on team structure?
I think it ultimately depends on the company. I think that's kind of a cop-out answer, but it's really true. I've seen pods. I've worked in center of excellences. I've seen where experimentation is part of everyone's job. It really depends on the kind of culture you have. Do you have accountability with the people, like product managers who are running the experiments, or are they just doing it, because someone just told them to? Most recently, we stood up at my last place of work, Canada's largest retailer. We stood up a center of excellence where folks would come to us with their questions. We'd coach them, set up the tooling for them, guide them to how to report the results, and build learning roadmaps. And it was kind of like a hit and miss. Some places it went well where the product folks or the growth folks got experimentation and they just needed some tips. They needed like, okay, well, this is how we do it. This is how we do it. Okay, I got it. Other people need a lot more handholding. And as time went on and the company turned over a lot of people, um, we found ourselves having to teach folks over and over and over and over again. And it became to a point where there are far too many people to support for a small COE. And that was a challenge. And the other parts were some lines of business that we support, because we supported all the lines of business for the company. They needed really detailed help. Like, we have a problem here. We don't have customer research about this area. We don't know how to analyze this funnel, like really handholdy stuff. Um, and we needed to know the business context, like what happened in the past and what they did in the past. So they were like, okay, well, center of excellence is nice, but we really need you embedded. We need
Mm.
you part of our product team. And we tried that model where we took a couple of people from the center of excellence and just shipped them out, stayed with the pods for a while, stood in all the sprints, all the sprint planning, all the ideation, and it was helpful. But that took them away from supporting the rest of the org. So it was kind of like there comes this tipping point between where a COE isn't good enough. They can't get into the weeds. They're too spread out. And a federated version where you're all spread out, like you can't knowledge share as efficiently. So that's why I kind of like hedge my bets and say it depends on where you're at.
Mm.
Um, yeah, this is probably not the answer you're looking for, but
No, I mean, that's an interesting answer, and let me poke at that a little bit. Like in
yeah,
my interviews thus far, I'm starting to recognize a pattern where certain organizations work on a product operating model, and I put like Disney and Spotify and Booking in this realm. So in the sense that they've got these aligned autonomous pods or squads or units that own touch points and swim lanes, and they have within those units they have capability sets around design and development and kind of the suite of functions that are needed. um, would that where you saw that happen, where you saw the hit and miss, I mean, would you describe that culture in your experience as a product operating model in that sense, or was it the you know the alternative, which would be project based operating model as an organization where there's a functional silos, meaning like a marketing led or sales led or an IT organization where they're punting over requests into a development Jira queue, and then those things come back. So to recap, I'm seeing a division in organizations on how they
yeah,
work, and then subsequently the experimentation COE or it works to certain degrees or not because of that organizational structure.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that?
Yeah, for sure. I think a COE could work in situations where they have dedicated resourcing. Like what's going to happen is like you punt it over to COE, and then you're going to have a backlog of work. Particularly if the COE has to satisfy a lot of different stakeholders, different lines of business, then you're going to have questions around which work is more important than the other. And folks may not want to wait for their tests to be addressed or their questions to be addressed. So you need to have a lot of resourcing for a COE. And that often at times I don't see it happening. Maybe it's just my experience, especially maybe it's because it's a large organizations that I've worked at. But getting the staffing is hard because how do you maximize those resources? Um, Another angle to consider is maybe the lines of businesses are not on the same tech stack. So the resources that you have in the center of excellence may not be equipped to be able to tackle all the different lines of business or the stakeholders. Some may be app, some may be web, some be like data services, some what have you. But to have resourcing that's able to just jump in to each one, that's tough. You can't maximize them. And these are unicorns you're trying to hire.
Well,
Yeah,
what it sounds like is that your COE, the way that you're viewing it or critiquing it, has a lot on their plate, and maybe I think in theory the COE personnel should be sort of working themselves out of a job.
yeah,
They should be training and supporting and elevating these different product owners to run their own ships. And so I think two ways to do that is from the training and the facilitation side, which is like, SOPs and documentation and training materials, normalization of tech stack to
yeah,
reference what you mentioned there. The other side of it is you know, I want to ask you this question about it. The other side of it is incentives and accountability systems. So you mentioned, like, in your experience, like, some, it was received well in some areas, but not in others, sort of hit or miss. And I'm curious about accountability and
yeah.
systems like ROI, like metric accountability systems for these pods and these units. I mean, I think that it doesn't necessarily mean they have to be incentivized to run an experiment per se,
Yeah,
but I'm thinking that my viewpoint right now is that they should be incentivized to measure outcome rather than
exactly.
output. And so, where is your thinking around the accountability systems for, with regards to a COE and a COE helping a product owner group, a little squad, do their thing?
My point of view, it's a little messy. Where several points of view here. I think you'll find the most success where the pods or the people you're helping from a COE perspective have those incentives around outcomes. I mean, that's obvious. If you're from what I've seen, if you're on the hook for retention or for revenue or what have you, then you're going to test like bananas. You're going to want to make sure that your work is working.
Mm.
If you're incentivized for delivery, then you're done. But the problem here becomes if you have a mix. If you have a group that is incentivized for revenue, another one for delivery of features, and you're in the center, how do you weigh the two against each other? And how do you set up your goals to line up with that? Where you might have a set of metrics around how many tests you run, which I think is crap, um, or learnings or revenue. And it's like a mishmash of KPIs for a COE. And that's something to keep in mind. If you have an org that's not heterogeneous and it's like just kind of different across the board, you're going to have a scoreboard of different aspects of what success looks like. And you're either going to have to force someone to make a call on which was more important, or you're going to have prioritization problems constantly.
Mm. Yeah, that's well put. That's cool. My last question here is on this topic around, like, experimentation, team structure, organizational structure. What are your do you have any assets or artifacts or recommended rituals in mind? And it can be from the standpoint of books or again, like just describing rituals. But for example, I'm really inspired by some early conversations I had with Lucas over at Booking, and he kind of put me into this thread around with Marty Kagan and the product operating model, and so I've been reading Accelerate, and
Mhm.
I had already read the Unicorn Project with regards to this world, and but it's kind of making me think that some of these problems have been solved outside of the
Yeah.
experimentation industry and universe, and they're being talked about in these other silos, these other echo chambers that we're not aware of. And so it can be in the form of like, books and articles and blog posts around this type of stuff. Does anything come to mind that you and your team in the past, or you yourself, have kind of leveraged or thought about in terms of like building a COE or building a team to work together more
Yeah.
efficiently? Any assets that I can collect from you?
And not so much as an asset, but it is definitely a ritual that I held at my last place of work and all the jobs I had before. I've held roles in product and marketing. It's still useful in all of them, particularly if you're supporting different lines of business and different types of stakeholders, where we do a retrospective. If you're familiar with product management, you do a regular retrospective in terms of what's working, what should continue, what should stop. But especially if you're embedding resourcing into different pods or folks don't talk as much, it's a forcing function to go to create ways of working. That's what's working for here, we should bring over to this other place, and what's working for there and what's not working for there, we should stop doing elsewhere. Forcing that knowledge sharing actually it sounds simple, but forcing it every week, you learn a lot and you create action items out of those. Like, okay, we'll develop our standard operating procedure to do XYZ, document it, and just repeat. And just this discipline of constantly improving your craft really helps. It works in the product world for sure. And that's why I bring it over to experimentation.
Every week, you said.
Yeah. We
Like,
were like, maybe it's a little intense,
yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah,
but because of the cadences of the different people we work, sometimes people are on weekly sprints, 3 weeks, 2 weeks. It
yeah,
was all over the place. um, we had to like, okay, every week. It wasn't long. It was like half
yeah,
hour or an hour, right?
yeah, yeah,
If
yeah.
there's nothing, there's nothing. But there's always something.
Yeah, we've got some good retro kind of ritual kind of stuff that we do in Miro. Usually, yeah, quick, like 15 minutes. I mean, it
Yep.
can get you so long, but we usually do, we do it like month. The weekly is like, it's a new level. Thanks, Rommel. I appreciate it. I like to keep these kind of short and sweet. That's
Yeah.
great to hear from you. And yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.